LinkedIn or through various other social media. We are a community that is truly focused on incubating leadership. And we do that through a few different domains, through personal leadership, through developing a network that is focused on leadership development, as well as creating solutions that really make a difference in furthering leadership. All of these efforts are designed to improve our ability to, either at the individual level, the organizational level, the societal level, etc., to drive meaningful results and impact. We have a summit coming up in early July. Between now and then, we're having weekly get-togethers where we can explore in a highly interactive way various topics as we build momentum towards our summit. And the summit is just a milestone along the journey, because our leadership forum community is focused on leadership development and incubation every day of the year. And through the network that we develop, we have really a support for each of us and the organizations and communities that we serve to do better. So with that, we're just excited that you all are participating. We're having great momentum from people all across the globe participating in these sessions. Today, right now, we have about 55 participants. Last week, we had about the same. And we would just express to all of you, if this really makes a difference to you in your lives today, spread the word. Tell 2 or 3 people. Invite them to the next session and the next session after that. So with that, shall I turn it over to Lyndon?
Yes, please. Great.
Lyndon, so glad to have you here.
Great, thank you, Howard. Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen here so that you can see my slides. Good, they're up. So welcome everyone. I'm really delighted to be with you here today. I've had a chance to be part of the Leadership Forum in person a couple of times over the years, and really excited about the opportunity in the midst of this crisis for us to broaden the community and connect with so many people around the world. And delighted to see on this call some old friends who are dialing in from as far away as India and Africa and North America. So we've got a global community here today. And the theme for our conversation today is really around the nature of change and transformation. And you'll see on the visual that we have here, the little butterflies, the classic analogy of metamorphosis that reflects the nature of change. But also you know the analogy of when a butterfly flaps its wings, it can trigger far-reaching impacts like a typhoon out in the Pacific. And as it so happens, we've got a cyclone brewing off the coast of India coming on shore. We've got one here, a hurricane off the coast of North America. So it also speaks to this big interconnected world that we have today. And as we were thinking about the topic for today, really thinking about speaking to the issue of change. And what occurs to us is that, change is both personal, but it's also systemic. And many folks who were part of the conversation last week suggested that they'd like to talk about their own journey through change. So we're going to do 2 things today. We're going to start out with really thinking about the journey of self through this process of change and transformation. And in the second half of our hour, we're going to pivot to really thinking about our organizations and our communities from a more systemic lens. So most models of change look something like this, some kind of U-shaped curve. I think Joel shared one last week when I think it was called the process of creating anything great or anything new. And it really reflects a downward trajectory before we start to reach upward. And if you think about this particular model, which is a variation of something that you might have seen called the 4 or 5 stages of grief, it starts out with a trigger event that happens. And often, as is the case, we might respond with not really paying attention, denying it, ignoring it. So you think about the coronavirus. For many of us, it started way out there in China, and it seemed something that was perhaps significant over there, but it didn't necessarily seem like it would come as far as it has, that would be a life-changing event for everybody around the world. And in so many ways, the change that happens in our lives or around us are things that generate a lot of hype, and we know sometimes better than to take it too seriously. So a human tendency is to say, well, I see it out there, but I'm not necessarily going to get bent out of shape about it. It so happens that oftentimes, as is the nature of crisis, it becomes more real. It comes to us, it starts to change our lives. And we move into a certain kind of emotional state, especially if it's something that we don't want. And we might respond with aversion. This might look like anger, it might look like sadness, frustration, all the emotions that we might feel. But it doesn't necessarily cause us to change our behavior. It's much more about resisting, about reacting in a negative way. As the journey kind of continues, we might find ourselves in a state of acceptance. We say, well, this is reality. This is the new normal. I can't avoid it anymore. And I have to move to being able to accept it and really starting to make my peace with it. In this stage, even if we don't know what we're going to do differently in response to the change, it prepares us to move into that fourth stage where we start to lean into the change, where we start to explore the possibilities, try to find a new way in this new normal. And finally, as we do that, as we start to regroup, rethink, start to operate in new ways, we start to evolve. And this is the stage of transformation where oftentimes we might find ourselves, if things have gone well, that we're in a better place than we were before. So in many ways, change is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to grow, for us to transform, whether or not it's the things that we perhaps might have chosen for ourselves. But it happens if we're able to kind of lean into change, if we are able to respond to the opportunities that might be embedded in all of this. So as you think about this journey, perhaps you find yourself in one of these stages today. So I'd like for Matt maybe to initiate a poll for us here that'll ask you to respond to a question. Where do you find yourself at this time in these stages of change? And perhaps some of you might say, well, at 6 that I'm in all of the above, I'm going back and forth, and that's perhaps not unusual, but it would invite you to think about where's your center of gravity? Where do you really find yourself right now in this process of change that we're all going through? So Matt?
Lyndon, while Matt puts up the poll, could you please go back to the previous slide?
Sure. Go back there. And if the Matt, should I wait for the poll? But if it isn't working, we could also use the chat if you want.
Yeah, let's go with the chat
Okay.
for now. Yes.
Okay. So feel free to respond with a number in the chat. It could be a 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. Where do you find yourself right now along this journey of change? And I know that in my screen right now, I can't necessarily see the chat, so I might just stop sharing for a moment. Okay, so just brought us out of my screen share so I can see the chat. I don't know if that's the same for all of you, but I see people responding with a lot of 3s and 4s and 5s. Some of us are in perhaps a 2, but of course, there's no denying what's actually happening, and we might feel a little frustrated with what's going on, but we're in a state for many of us in acceptance and starting to really explore what's going on. We see a few 5s where people feel that they've already grown and started to incorporate this crisis into their new reality and finding new possibilities. That's really great to hear, right? So I'm going to go back into my screen share in the presentation here. So when we come into this process of change and we think about where we are on the journey, the question is, if we want to move into a space of starting to co-create and find our new way, what might we do, right? And I'd like to put in front of you a framework that comes from the literature on leadership that you might be familiar with. And it offers us 4 learning tactics for actually how we might lean into change or how might we learn. And oftentimes we think about change or learning as the process of education. And this might look like books we might read, classes we might attend. It might look like webinars you might watch. It could look like podcasts and videos. These are all forms of codified learning that somebody has created from their expertise. And we can watch it and we can, if you will, learn from them, but it usually doesn't stick very much because it isn't our knowledge. What's better than that oftentimes is when we can connect with other people and we can have a conversation. And what's different about that is we start to bring our own experiences to bear. We can perhaps go back and forth to start to customize knowledge, which is no longer generic like it is oftentimes in education, where it's being, if you will, downloaded to a lot of people. We can start to think about what this really means in terms of our own context. So coaching, mentoring, having guides reflects this kind of developmental conversation. Yet another way, and perhaps the most powerful in this, is learning by doing, by taking action. And what makes this so powerful is that it's full-bodied learning, right? We're immersed in the context and we can learn from actually what's working, and we can bring so much of what we're feeling and what we know into the mix of learning. And for those of us who are in the leadership field, you're probably familiar with the framework called 70-20-10 that comes from a study called Lessons of Experience that was initiated by the Center for Creative Leadership. And this kind of suggests that 70% of our learning actually comes by doing and 20% from connecting with others from these developmental conversations. And only 10% might actually come from some kind of codified source like training or a book, etc. But there's a 4th path, so I call the 70-20-10 plus, that is oftentimes ignored, which is really about the zone of contemplation and reflection. And in a way, reflection is the glue between the other forms of learning. It helps us internalize what's actually going on, but it also helps us connect with what's going on within us and the wisdom that we've perhaps acquired over the course of our lives and helping us make sense of it. So oftentimes our minds are really busy, right, with all that's going on, that we don't have the space to really think clearly. And, you know, Gandhi famously said, you know, I've got a really busy day today, so I need to meditate an hour extra. And like many great leaders, he was recognizing creating the space for us to pause allows us to make sense of what's going on and be intentional about our actions and show up in the ways that we might want to share. So I'd love to push us now forward into the discussion groups, because what makes these communities great is part of that model of connection, right, that we talked about, the ability to actually share with each other versus listen to somebody like me talk. So I've got 2 questions for you as you move into these discussion groups. How have you grown from the existing crisis? Many of us have said that we're in perhaps a state of 4 or 5. And even if we're not all the way there, we're starting to see changes in how we're operating, how we are learning new things, how we're showing up in new ways. And if you think about what has actually gone on in your life, what has actually helped you grow? So that slide before that's talked about the shifts we might make that have helped us grow, and there might be others that you can put your finger on. What has actually helped you grow? So with that, Matt, I'd love for you to move us into these discussion groups so that we can talk with a few others about our own journey.
Sounds good. I am setting up the breakout rooms now.
And I've got about 15 minutes for us. So hopefully it gives us, if we're in groups of about 4, should give us about 4 minutes or so each to talk. It might be a good practice for you if you wish, so that you can share the time, is to maybe briefly type up a response to your statement once you get into the discussion groups, into your chat, and will help you perhaps share the time more effectively.
Sending people to breakout rooms now.
Fantastic.
Hi, my name is Madhvi. I am from Bangalore, India. I am the dean of a business school, which is called as Wellingkers, also known as V School. My area of interest is in finance, but I also am.
Mm-hmm. I feel like that relates to the question of, how have you grown from the crisis? I'm working on helping your son grow about headset and cereal.
Yeah, trying. Yeah, so I
Hey, Renee. Were you able to find the link?
Hi.
Can you hear me? Hello?
See that societies perhaps like Vietnam and Singapore and South Korea, places that might have experienced things like SARS and the bird flu before, perhaps had some principles that they could activate. And for us here in America, for instance, where we haven't had these catastrophes at the same level, perhaps we haven't had as good plans and contingencies there. But nonetheless, we've all been called to improvise. In the midst of this crisis, so we've also been forced to think about the long-term impacts and certainly the short-term. So the short-term are really responding to providing the healthcare for people, keeping people safe, providing the equipment that people might need, the loans to make it through, but the long-term economic consequences as well, that we have to think about the loss of jobs. And how do we balance those two forces? It's not one or the other. So in this model of polarities, it really raises for us that we really need to operate collectively together, but we need to operate from a higher lens than we normally might do in normal circumstances. So what does it take to do this well? So again, a couple of examples from the learning from Katrina. And there was a report that we put out called Stepping into the Void, which you can find online. And there were two kinds of organizations in particular that stood up as models. One was the Coast Guard. And the Coast Guard is an organization that is, of course, built for crisis, for search and rescue, for helping people when perhaps they've been trapped out in the ocean or they find themselves stuck somewhere. But the Coast Guard, in a way, was called to do in Katrina something truly exceptional even for itself. So the pilots that were flying the mission said they actually flew in the space of those 10 days more missions than they might actually do in an entire career. They were trained, of course, to conduct open water rescues, but here they were actually flying into the cities and having to pull people out through the roofs of their homes to fly without aircraft control in between power lines. It was really an exceptional circumstance that was there, that, if you will, that was different than that they were even prepared for. But actually what enabled them to function is that they actually focus on a lot of empowerment. So they have a concept of frontline initiative. So in the Coast Guard, they actually trust the people that are on the scene to make wise decisions and take the action. They don't rely on them to kind of vet decisions up through the chain of command, and the chain of command will actually back them up in terms of the actions that they take. So they build us into the operating mode, recognizing that top-down leadership actually doesn't work. And this might have been a significant difference between perhaps how local military or the police were able to operate, which didn't have this culture of empowerment and the ability for people to flex. There's also a community called Ville, which is one of the poorest communities in America. And it sits in the path where people were evacuating out of the city. And it's a town of about 7,000 people, 8,000 perhaps, somewhere there today. And they found that they had as many evacuees as members in the city. And somehow this city, this little town, found a way to take care of everybody who showed up there, got them a place to stay and food to eat. And it really happened because there's a woman that you see on the screen. Her name is Jennifer Vidrine, who's now the mayor of the city. But back then she was a community worker. And she saw this need and she got on the local radio station and she put out a call and said, we've got people here who need a place to stay. They need X and they need Y. And the entire town mobilized behind that. Now, what made that possible was that in one level, this was a very, very poor place and people weren't used to actually having a lot of help come in from the outside. So they were, one, very empowered, very self-reliant, and two, that they actually had a culture because of living in hard times, of helping each other. So if you walk down the streets of Ville, and if you were doing some yard work, somebody walking past would stop and say, hey, do you need any help? And so they had this culture of actually helping each other and allowed the city, the small town, to actually respond in this collective way to the crisis. So as we look at this and say, well, we're in the midst of a very, very significant crisis, unlike Katrina, if you will, where there were, of course, long-term kind of impacts, but it was isolated in one place. We're now in the midst of a crisis that's far-reaching, and it's far from certain as to saying, you know, what the future is going to look like. It could well be that things are going to get worse, both from a healthcare perspective or from an economic perspective than what we've seen so far. So it's really an opportunity to think about what we can really do. And I'd like to bring you to two key points here. And it's to think about, in the midst of all of this, it's the connections that we have to other people that enable us to respond more fully, that we actually need an expanded network to be able to foster this collective leadership. And the second aspect, as you think about your own organizations as well, and you think about yourself, is how do you increase the sense of empowerment, the ability of people to actually act? Because it's not enough that we have perhaps the centralized control that guides everything. We actually need to empower people in the midst of the organization to take action. So with that, I'd like to bring us into our second discussion group and to turn your lens into much more the organization or the community capacity that you might find yourself in, and saying, well, how do we build greater collective leadership? How do we connect much more, as we're doing today on this leadership call? And how do we increase the empowerment of people and provide the safety so that they can start to step into the void, if you will? So with Matt, I'd invite you to bring us into the next chat, and perhaps for a shorter period of time here.
Sounds good. I just posted the questions in the chat for everyone to review, and I'm sending you back into your breakout rooms.
The network, because it really takes greater collective capacity. And how do you increase the sense of empowerment, both for yourself, but for others, so that we can start to feel like we can flex and take the risks and do the things that we might need to respond to the crisis. So to summarize, this is really about two forces that are moving in parallel. There's the need to kind of turn inward, to kind of deepen our sense of intention and say, what are we truly about? Even if this crisis is upon us, what really matters most to us? to actually strengthen our sense of awareness, to actually process so much of what's going on and be thoughtful so that we can start to see the patterns and think more clearly about the actions we might take. And then increase our sense of empowerment, give us a permission to perhaps do some things that we aren't used to doing, in respecting that we perhaps need to grow our capabilities from what we already know how to do. And that failure is part of the course, but we're not going to get everything right. And at the same time, there's need to broaden out. And we talked about how do we expand the networks that we have, the capabilities, the people that we know, our skill sets, etc. But also how do we grow new experiences, let ourselves build the capability to try some things out, knowing that we might very well fail from doing this, but that we will learn from it. And this in the end is going to increase the capacity that we have as leaders. So really thinking about both the sides of actually expanding and growing those capabilities, but also spending more time with ourselves to deepen our sense of intention and clarity about what's going on. And we've really touched the surface in this session about the pathways that we can kind of take care of ourselves and transform ourselves as individuals through crisis. And we've talked a little bit about what it takes to operate in systems and organizations to grow our collective capacity through building our networks and the collective sense of empowerment. So if you're interested in these ideas, you might find that for those of you who don't know him, Ori Sharma has got something called Theory U, which also reflects this U-shaped curve. And in this model here that you can see, it's from a piece that he wrote called 8 Emerging Lessons that was specifically about what's going on right now with the coronavirus. You can see that he's talking about how we need to kind of grow in new areas, then reflect traditional capabilities that we practice in leadership development. It's an opportunity to come back into that. So as we move forward, I just want to close you out with a quotation that I like, and it comes from a poem that used to circulate at the time of the millennial closing, when perhaps people felt that when the state of crisis and perhaps the world was going to end as well in a certain kind of way. And it's attributed to the Hopi elders who had some wisdom to share. So I'll read this out to you. And it's called "We Are the Ones We've Been Waiting For." And it says, "There's a river flowing now very fast. It's so great and swift that there are those who will be afraid. They'll try to hold on to the shore, try to kind of do the same things that they've done before. And they'll feel like they've been torn apart and they will suffer greatly. But know that the river has its destination. The elders say, we must let go of the shore and push off towards the middle of the river. Keep our eyes open and heads above water. See who's there with you. It's about the collective journey, and celebrate. At this time in history, we are to take nothing personally, least of all ourselves." So with that, I'd really like to bring us back into the group here to really say that it's really about all of us and bring our capabilities to let go of the shore, to not hold on to the ways that we perhaps knew the world to be, and kind of embrace the current and use that to navigate ourselves to a better future. And that's the promise of transformation. It's the ability to grow from crisis, to not just go back to the way things were, but to become people who are perhaps more able to reach our potential. So I'd invite us, if you wish, to unmute and use the chat, perhaps to offer any final reflections or questions.
I'd like to just add a comment, 2 comments. Fantastic presentation today. My biggest fear is that we as a global society will not learn from the last several months as we begin to get out of this quagmire that we're in. And it kind of reminds me of these videos they're showing specifically around the country of India, pre-COVID-19 and post-COVID-19, just that battle cry for environmental controls. And if you take that down and diverge it to everyday life, we as human beings have to make dramatic changes or we're going to be right back in the same boat. So that's my biggest fear.
Thank you, Jelly.
Actually, it's Inga. I would back up what you just said. I'm reading now journals by Sándor Márai. He was a very famous Hungarian writer, and this journal is from the Second World War, actually the end of it. And one of his reflection is that the world comes back to its own old ways after the crisis, that within the crisis we promise ourselves to do differently, and then we just go back to old, sorrows and worries and so on. And I thought about it a little bit, and I think we are more conscious than people then, even through use of internet and approach to education or access to education. So there is a great, I think, hope in people who can build higher awareness around it, and just to speak openly that if we don't think about the crisis in a conscious way, nothing will change. So it's actually within our own hands, yes? So
Yes.
Yeah, so that's how I see it a little bit.
And it's classic change management, that you can make the change, but unless you can figure out how to sustain the change, once it's made, people will revert back to their comfort zones and what they've done before. So it's figuring out what kind of energy do we need to maintain change.
I would just say I couldn't agree more in terms of the change management. I think that the duration of this actually has the silver lining of we are being reinforced on the things that are working now and seeing the value of that. So it's less likely that we may just revert to old ways if we continue to manage the way that we are effectively now, seeing the positive outcome and not just falling back to old ways of doing, because we've already seen that there are benefits to the current approach.
Great.
Try to maintain positive.
So I think that's exactly right. We take a look at 9/11 as an example, and we see how it brought us together so closely for 3 weeks, and then we went back to our old ways, and we can argue that all of this time in between has put us into a position where we're more bifurcated than we've ever been, and we have to find ways to use this pandemic that can separate us. We have to find ways to help us bring us back together.
Who is the we we're talking about?
I hope it's not my generation. We blew it. I say that with all due respect. I mean, I'll be 74 in June, and my generation blew it. We blew it. We need young people to step up to the plate and push us. That's what we need. Anybody under 70.
I think we refers to everyone. And
I hope so.
Charlie, we can take your generation's lessons, every generation's lessons, find the things that we did right, find the things that we did wrong, and find consensus in all of it.
Great. Well, I want to pull us back because I know we're running out of time here, and Matt or Joel, to turn it back to you just for some closing thoughts. Really, the theme for the series is incubating leadership, and we need to build new capability for leadership, more transformational leadership to rise to the challenge and create a better world. So back to you, Matt or Joel, to perhaps close us out here. But thank you, everybody, for all your thoughts and for joining us today.
Thank you,
Great job, Lyndon. Great job, Lyndon.
Presentation.
Excuse me for being so rude, Joel. It's Jane. Hi.
Hey, Jane.
Can you give me 30 seconds? I want to make a request.
Yes.
And this is me practicing my commitment to myself, inspired by this community. Next week, and I'll come back next week, I want to be more deliberate about hearing the voices of the whole community, because at the end, I loved hearing, and I don't know everyone's name, but the men who spoke at the end I loved it. And I'm going to hang up wishing I had prompted some female voices or other gendered voices to speak. So I'm just trying to keep a promise to myself to find my own advocacy voice in the moment. And I'm inviting men of all backgrounds, and white men in particular, to pause and ask if there are any women who might want to speak before you do. Thank you, Joel.
Well, and with that, I don't know if I was supposed to close, so I will hand it to one of my female colleagues.
I think it's me.
Oh, Tanya.
Oh, Jane! You just made it crazy. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. So yeah, I'm just gonna keep it short. This was a really good session. I think as we talked about in our groups, this has been going on for while. So a couple of the things, keep the conversation going. I know I wasn't able to finish my conversation, so we have the coffee hour, and that's tomorrow. And we also have Slack, which I've been a little behind on. And we also have many different social media spaces that you can continue talking in. And we'll see you again next week. We are talking about leading the way forward in unprecedented times. And it's really great to see everybody. And that's about all we have for today. Hopefully we can continue the conversation on social media and Slack. And we'll see everybody next week. And thanks again, Lyndon.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And hope you can make the coffee chat tomorrow, same time.
Nice job, Lyndon.
Thank you.
You all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.